Well, while these declarations might be largely symbolic in a legal sense, I mean, Heydarian isn't legally barred from entering these areas.
Right, it's not a literal ban.
No. But their real power lies in their public and, you could say, performative aspect. They represented a united front against what was perceived as a slight, often seen as originating from Manila.
Mm.
A powerful assertion of regional pride and solidarity.
And then we get to the core of the factual disagreement.
Mm.
The HDI figures themselves. Heydarian stated that Mindanao's HDI was similar to Sub-Saharan African levels. What did the actual data reveal?
Well, the response from various Mindanaoan authorities and institutions was swift and, importantly, fact-based. They quickly pointed to data from the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program,
Okay.
and also the Mindanao Development Authority.
And what do those figures actually show us? Was the comparison accurate?
According to Minda's data from 2022, the overall HDI for Mindanao stood at 0.68.
Okay, 0.68.
And they were quick to highlight that this was considerably higher than the aggregate HDI for Sub-Saharan Africa in the same year, which was 0.549.
Ah, so quite a gap.
A noticeable gap, yes. In fact, Mindanao's HDI even surpassed the aggregate for South Asia, which was 0.641. So a notable difference.
It's a significant difference indeed. It really undermines that direct comparison quite clearly.
Absolutely. And Minda also emphasized a positive trend. All regions within Mindanao had actually demonstrated improvements in their HDI over the preceding 5 years.
So progress was being made.
Indicating a consistent pattern of progress across the island, which makes the comparison feel even more, well, out of touch.
Interestingly, even Heydarian himself later shared some more recent data, though it was unconfirmed by NIDEA, the National Economic and Development Authority.
Right, that caveat is important.
Suggesting medium to high HDI for certain Mindanao regions in 2024. Why the discrepancy then? Did he just use old data initially?
Yeah. That later posting, which came after the initial wave of criticism, suggests either perhaps a reassessment on his part or maybe access to more current localized data that wasn't part of his initial broad statement.
I see.
But the original comparison was pretty clearly based on older or perhaps aggregate data that didn't accurately reflect the comparative HDI levels at the time he made the statement.
And it sounds like for many in Mindanao, these HDI figures aren't just abstract statistics floating around.
No, not at all.
They represent something more tangible, like a measure of their region's development and their own sense of dignity.
Precisely.
So Heydarian's statement was perceived as minimizing their achievements. Why was this so deeply felt?
Exactly. It wasn't simply about a statistical error. It was interpreted as a dismissal of the real advancements the region has made and, frankly, a belittling of the efforts of its people.
Okay, let's delve into why that specific comparison to Sub-Saharan Africa was so inflammatory. It seems to have touched on a really raw nerve.
It did. Local officials used very strong terms. You heard things like false narratives, baseless comparison, grave insult.
Certain language.
Very. The core issue was the feel that it reinforced these long-standing negative stereotypes of Mindanao, perpetually impoverished, maybe even unsafe. Stereotypes that, unfortunately, can fuel prejudice against its people.
We even heard Councillor Aranar speak about the neglect of Mindanao's positive aspects, and Mayor Xiao characterized the comparison as divisive.
Right.
What's the underlying concern there? Is it just about image?
It's more than just image, I think. The concern is that this kind of comparison overshadows the progress, the vibrancy, the potential of Mindanao. It contributes to a skewed and negative public perception.
Good.
And the Sub-Saharan Africa comparison itself, regardless of the specific data, carries certain negative connotations in global discourse, often unfairly associated with significant developmental challenges.
It's become a kind of shorthand.
Exactly. So applying that broad brush to Mindanao was seen as deeply offensive.
And this all ties back, doesn't it, to those long-standing historical grievances in Mindanao. That feeling of being marginalized, misrepresented by what's often termed Imperial Manila.
It absolutely does.
It's quite ironic then, considering Heydarian stated his intention was to critique that very neglect. How did that irony play out?
It did seem to backfire significantly. The chosen analogy, which he intended to highlight neglect, instead inflamed the very sensitivities around negative stereotyping and historical marginalization that he claimed to be addressing.
So it undermined his intended message.
Completely.
So how did Heydarian respond to this widespread criticism? What was his explanation or defense? Did he double down?
He largely argued that his statements were taken out of context. He attributed some of the backlash to fake news and online trolls.
the usual suspects.
Right. He maintained that his aim was simply to highlight existing developmental disparities. He did issue apologies for any inadvertent or unintended hurt that his words may have caused.
Okay. And the public reaction wasn't entirely serious condemnation, was it? I seem to recall seeing some rather sarcastic responses online, too.
That's right. The Sub-Saharan Mindanao memes definitely circulated widely,
Right.
which indicates that while there was genuine anger, there was also a layer of sardonic humor, maybe a way for people to process the perceived absurdity of the comparison.
Okay, so we've examined the controversy itself, the statement, the reaction, the data. Now, to understand the potential electoral impact, we really need to understand the Mindanao voter. And it's clearly not a single unified bloc.
Absolutely not. The electoral landscape in Mindanao is incredibly diverse and influenced by a multitude, a whole web of interacting factors.
Let's try and break down some of those key influences. What generally shapes voting decisions in Mindanao? What are we looking at?
Well, one significant factor, common across the Philippines really, is candidate orientation.
Personality-driven.
Very much so. Voters often prioritize the individual candidate's personality, their name recognition, just how well-known they are, and their perceived character. Sometimes even more than specific policy platforms.
That aligns with what we often hear about Philippine elections generally. What else plays a crucial role, specifically in Mindanao?
The influence of political dynasties is immense. Mindanao is home to numerous powerful political families with deep local roots, substantial resources.
The Dutertes being the obvious example.
The most prominent recent example, absolutely. They demonstrate that lasting strength, and they offer a sense of familiarity, a recognizable brand, you could say, to voters. These long-established structures continue to wield considerable influence, even with modernization.
So family names still carries significant weight at the ballot box there? What about the role of political parties? Are they strong?
Interestingly, the party system in the Philippines is generally considered to be relatively weak, and Mindanao is no exception. Party affiliation often takes a secondary role compared to those candidate-centric factors in the local dynamics, like the dynasties we just discussed. Voters tend to be more loyal to individuals and families than to abstract party ideologies.
Okay, so it's more about who you know or whose family you know than the party banner they fly.
Yeah.
What about the everyday concerns of the people, the bread and butter issue?
Oh, absolutely critical. Socio-economic factors and local issues are hugely important. Poverty, access to essential services, healthcare, education, the availability of economic opportunities.
The basics.
The basics. These are often right at the forefront of voters' minds. Candidates who are perceived as being effective in addressing these very tangible local needs tend to garner strong support.
Given Mindanao's complex history, I imagine peace and security remain significant considerations, particularly in certain areas.
Absolutely essential. In regions that have experienced conflict, especially within Barem, issues such as interclan feuds, what's known locally as
Rito, right.
the progress of the peace process itself, and just overall law and order are paramount concerns that significantly shape voting choices. You can't separate politics from that context.
And Mindanao is incredibly diverse, ethnically, religiously. How does that diversity influence political alignments?
That diversity is fundamental. It's woven into the fabric of Mindanao's political landscape. The different Muslim, Christian, and Lumad or indigenous peoples' identities often play a role in political affiliations.
Okay.
For instance, the concept of a shared Bangsamoro identity can be a powerful unifying force in Barm politics. But even within that, you also see political divisions along specific ethnic lines.
Interesting.
And we also need to consider things like the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, and the practice of block voting by influential religious organizations like the Iglesia Ni Cristo, the INC, that can significantly impact election outcomes in certain areas.
And then there's that strong undercurrent we talked about, historical grievance and regionalism, that feeling of being neglected or misunderstood by the central government in Manila.
Precisely. This fuels a strong sense of regional identity, which often manifests in the Solid South phenomenon, where Mindanao sometimes votes as a bloc for candidates seen as strong advocates for the region's interests.
And the Heydarian backlash seems like a perfect example of that.
A very clear demonstration of this regional solidarity in action, yes.
Finally, how does the media and overall information environment impact voting decisions down there? Is it different from elsewhere?
Social media platforms are increasingly influential, just like elsewhere, but may be particularly potent in shaping opinion, especially among younger voters. Pre-election surveys also generate discussion and can influence perceptions of who's viable, who's not.
Sure.
And of course, the narratives presented by national media outlets, often Manila-based, also play a role in shaping how voters view the political landscape, sometimes reinforcing that regional divide we mentioned.
It's really clear that Mindanao is a very complex, very heterogeneous voting landscape.
Yeah.
You mentioned the distinct heterogeneity within the region itself earlier. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Absolutely. It's crucial not to paint Mindanao with a single brush. It's comprised of 6 distinct administrative regions. You've got the Zamboanga Peninsula, northern Mindanao, the Davao region, Sasi, CX, Sarjan, Caraga, and Barem, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao.
Right, each quite different.
Each with its own unique ethnic and religious makeup, varying levels of economic development, different historical experiences, and distinct political dynamics. Barem, in particular, is unique.
How so?
Well, with its recent establishment following peace agreements and its ongoing political transition, the influence of former revolutionary groups like the MILF and MNLF and upcoming regional elections, it presents a very unique set of electoral considerations.
And even within those regions?
Even within regions, you have significant ethnic diversity. Think about the Maranaos, Maguindanans, Tasigs, various Lumad groups, Christian settlers, and wide variations in economic performance across different provinces.
So a statement like Heydarian's isn't going to be received or processed in the exact same way across all these diverse local contexts. It's not a uniform reaction.
Exactly. The impact, whatever it is, will inevitably be filtered through these existing local realities, loyalties, and priorities. What matters in Davao City might be different from what matters in, say, Llano del Sur.
Okay, so we have this controversial statement, the backlash, and a very complex picture of the Mindanao voter. How might these two elements connect? What are the potential ways this kind of discourse could actually influence how people vote? Are there theories that help us understand this?
Well, we can look at some relevant social psychology. Social identity theory, for instance, suggests that when a group's shared identity, in this case, being Mindanaoan, is perceived as being threatened or insulted.
Like with Heydarian's comment.
Precisely. It can lead to a strengthening of in-group solidarity. People feel closer to fellow Mindanaoans and potentially more negative feelings towards the out-group, which might be perceived as Manila or critics like Heydarian.
So the feeling of being disrespected could actually strengthen people's sense of regional identity and their connection to other Mindanaoans.
That's interesting. It can, yes. This feeling of disrespect can also trigger strong emotional responses, pride, anger, a desire to reassert the group's dignity and worth.
And that could motivate action.
It certainly can translate into political action, potentially. Furthermore, when negative stereotypes are reinforced, as many felt they were here, it can fuel a desire for a stronger regional voice in politics, someone who can effectively counter those misrepresentations on a bigger stage.
It sounds like the Heydarian incident could be strategically used then to reinforce that us versus them narrative Mindanao against what are perceived as Manila-centric criticisms or slights.
Absolutely. That's a classic political tool. The widespread condemnation we witness shows how readily that narrative can be activated.
Right.
And it could potentially become a potent tool for political mobilization by those who wish to position themselves as champions of the region.
So how might this actually manifest in voting behavior? What are some potential impacts on how people cast their ballots? Could it swing votes?
Well, one potential impact is a further strengthening of that regional identity and maybe anti-Manila sentiment. Voters might be more inclined, perhaps subconsciously, to support candidates who are perceived as strong defenders of Mindanao's interests.
The ones who spoke out loudly.
Especially those who publicly and vocally condemned the remarks or who have a track record of prioritizing the region.
So we might see a boost in support for those perceived as Mindanao champions.
Exactly. Political figures who were quick to defend the region and its people might see an increase in their popularity or at least burnish their credentials. Conversely, there could be a negative impact on any individuals or groups perceived to be aligned with the perceived slight, though making those connections stick in the minds of voters can be complex. It depends on how it's framed.
It's also interesting to think about how this kind of controversy might affect overall voter engagement. Does it make people more likely to vote or less?
That's a good question, and it could go either way. For some, it could lead to increased voter turnout, a feeling that they need to go out and make their voices heard in response to what they see as an injustice.
A sort of protest vote?
Maybe. But for others, it might lead to greater cynicism or apathy. A feeling that their region is consistently being misrepresented no matter what they do, so why bother?
But, as we discussed earlier, the impact might be tempered, right? by those other more deeply rooted factors that influence voting in Mindanao.
Precisely. That's the crucial caveat. Established patronage networks, loyalties to political dynasties, immediate socioeconomic concerns at the local level, these might still be the primary drivers for many, many voters.
So those could overshadow the influence of this particular controversy.
Potentially, yes. And the reported withdrawal of that resolution in Davao City related to this issue could suggest that, other local priorities are perhaps taking precedence, at least for some political actors.
It seems like the emotional impact, that feeling of being insulted, the hit to dignity, might have had a more immediate and widespread effect than any factual rebuttal of the HDI figures. Why do you think that is?
That's likely because emotions like pride, dignity, group identity, they're very powerful motivators. The initial reaction was deeply personal for many Mindanaoans. It focused on the perceived disrespect, the challenge to their regional identity.
More gut level than analytical.
You could say that. While factual corrections are important for informing the debate long term, addressing those underlying emotional responses is often key in the short term when it comes to public perception and potentially political mobilization.
And these kinds of controversies could also spur people in Mindanao to demand stronger, maybe more effective representation. Voices that can actively challenge and counter these kinds of misrepresentations in the national discourse.
Absolutely. That's a potential positive outcome, in a way. We've already seen examples of local officials and civil society groups actively pushing back against the narrative, reasserting the positive aspects of the region's identity and progress. This kind of incident can sometimes catalyze a stronger sense of collective advocacy.
So as we weigh everything up, try to balance the scales, what's more likely to have a lasting impact on voting behavior in Mindanao? This short-term, maybe intense outrage, or those more enduring electoral factors we've discussed?
That's the central question we're trying to get at, isn't it? The media certainly played a significant role in amplifying the initial controversy, and social media allowed for that rapid, widespread online backlash. We saw it happen almost instantly.
It went viral quickly.
It did. However, it's really crucial to differentiate between that immediate emotional response, that wave of indignation, and any fundamental long-term shifts in how people will ultimately vote come Election Day.
You're suggesting that while the anger and disappointment were palpable, maybe even unifying for a moment, they might not necessarily translate into a different voting choice if those deeper loyalties or pressing local needs remain the primary drivers for many.
Precisely. That's the most likely scenario, I think. While emotions can certainly influence attitudes and maybe even voting preferences to some extent, there's research on that.
Sure.
The key question is whether the specific feeling of offense over Heydarian's statement will ultimately outweigh those deeply entrenched factors like kinship ties in politics, dynastic loyalties, or the immediate need for, say, local infrastructure projects and social services.
And media outrage cycles can be short-lived.
They can be. Public attention moves on. Unless political actors actively work to frame and sustain the issue, keep bringing it up, its direct electoral impact might fade or become quite limited.
Okay, and how do those other major electoral factors, this dynasties, socioeconomic issues, peace and security, how do they intersect with this kind of controversy? Can they amplify it or diminish its impact on voting?
They can certainly do both. Political dynasties, for example, might attempt to capitalize on the public outrage. They might position themselves as the defenders of the region to shore up support.
Using it to their advantage.
Potentially. However, their pre-existing influence and patronage networks might also be strong enough that this issue doesn't really change much for their core supporters. It just becomes another talking point.
Right.
Similarly, socio-economic concerns might take precedence for many voters unless they somehow draw a direct link between the perceived disrespect and their material well-being, which is often hard to do.
And in conflict areas?
In conflict-affected areas, peace and security concerns will likely remain the dominant factors, probably overshadowing this particular controversy for most people living there.
And the bigger picture, national politics.
Exactly. The broader political landscape, the shifting dynamics of alliances at the national level. Think Marcos Duterte tensions, for example. Those larger narratives could either amplify or dilute the electoral impact of this specific controversy. It could get folded into those bigger fights.
It also sounds like the impact, whatever it is, won't be uniform across the entirety of Mindanao. It'll differ from place to place.
That's a crucial point to reiterate. The controversy is likely to resonate more strongly, perhaps, with politically engaged urban populations, maybe younger, more educated voters who are active online and more attuned to national discourse.
And less so elsewhere.
Possibly. Voters in more rural areas or those whose primary loyalties lie with local patronage networks might have very different priorities and could be less swayed by this particular issue compared to, say, the price of rice or local security.
And there's definitely an opportunity here for political actors within Mindanao to strategically leverage this situation, isn't there? To burnish their image as champions of the region, maybe criticize opponents.
Oh, absolutely. That's politics 101. We've seen how the Duterte family, for example, has historically been very effective at utilizing narratives of regional grievance to mobilize support.
They've been masters of it.
And similarly, local officials who were quick and vocal in condemning Heydarian have already positioned themselves as defenders of Mindanao. In a competitive political environment, any issue that can galvanize voters or differentiate candidates is likely to be strategically employed. It becomes part of the political toolkit.
So, to bring it all together then, what's the main conclusion we can draw from this deep dive into the Sub-Saharan Mindanao controversy and its potential influence on voting behavior? What's the bottom line?
Well, I think the central conclusion is that while Richard Heydarian's statement undoubtedly caused significant offense and ignited widespread discussion that's undeniable its impact on actual voting patterns in Mindanao, is likely to be more subtle, more indirect than a fundamental reshaping of electoral outcomes.
So not a game changer for election results.
Probably not a major game changer in itself. The deep-rooted and persistent nature of those existing electoral determinants we've discussed, the dynasties, the local issues, the patronage will likely continue to be the dominant forces at play.
So we're more likely to see maybe a mobilization of existing regional sentiment. Perhaps a reinforcement of that us versus them narrative.
Exactly.
Potentially leading to a slight advantage for candidates perceived as strong Mindanao champions, especially those who capitalized on the moment.
Exactly. Those are the more likely effects. But the key thing to remember is that translating that initial outrage into actual votes on election day is a complex process.
That's not automatic.
Not at all. It's filtered through that intricate web of local loyalties, socio-economic concerns, the established political landscape, and strategic calculations by politicians.
And ultimately, this incident, this whole controversy, it contributes to the ongoing narrative of Mindanao's identity, doesn't it? And its relationship with the national government.
It certainly does.
Reinforcing those feelings of being potentially misunderstood, maybe misrepresented, and potentially influencing long-term political allegiances in subtle ways down the road.
Precisely. It adds another layer, another chapter to the complex and evolving story of Mindanao's place within the broader Philippine nation. It's part of that ongoing dialogue and sometimes tension.
On that note, here's something for you, our listener, to consider after our deep dive today. How often do national conversations, wherever you are, truly account for the diverse regional experiences and sensitivities within a country?
That's a good question.
And what are the long-term implications of that when they don't for national unity and effective political representation? Maybe think about how local identities and concerns intersect with broader national narratives in your own community.